Aloha, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat briefly and note where you are logging in from, that would be awesome. And we'll get started. Let's see. Well, I'm just going to get started with the intro while people are logging in. So aloha, everyone, and welcome. My name is Andrea Nandoskar, and I'm the Education Program Manager at Historic Hawai Foundation. And I want to thank you for joining us for the 38th Annual Experts Historic Preservation Lecture Series. This series is co-curated and co-sponsored by the UH School of Architecture's Historic Preservation Graduate Certificate Program and Historic Hawai Foundation. And this year's theme is Conserving Architecture, and today's presenter will provide a worldwide perspective, and we'll get back to our presenter in a moment. Just a note, all of the lectures are being recorded and we'll be posting them on the HHF YouTube channel within a few days, and you can find them on the event page as well. If you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat. We have a very full presentation, so we'll do our best to address questions, as many as we can at the end. And there's also a brief survey at the end, if you'd be so kind as to complete that. It's 8 or 9 questions really quick. For those new to Historic Hawai Foundation, we are a statewide nonprofit. We help people save historic places. And these are sites that tell the stories of the multi-layered history of Hawaii. We do this through education, advocacy, assistance, and protection of and for historic places. I'd now like to introduce our series partner, Dr. William Chapman, Dean of the School of Architecture, University of Hawaii at Manoa, who will introduce today's presenter. Thank you, Dr. Chapman.
Mahalo nui, Andrea, and aloha mai kako, everybody. It's really nice to be back in this role. And many of you may remember me from before. For 25 years, I was the introducer for the program. And I am, once again, the director of the preservation program. And we have moved the preservation program to the School of Architecture, which is part of the reasoning for, in fact, having the series topic that we've chosen, which is architectural conservation. So I'd like to say a couple words about our presenter from before. Many of you knew and loved Ralph Cam, who for 6 years or 7 years, in fact, took on the task of curating and presenting this program. Many of you may know that tragically, just about a year ago, Ralph passed away, and we have great aloha for him and gratitude for him and miss him very much. He was my student and friend and colleague. And I also want to thank Carolyn Jones, who is our graduate assistant for the preservation program, for her help in setting everything up. And of course, Andrea and the Historic Hawai Foundation for being such a good partner over these last 38 years. So, and as many of you know, the program began with William Murtaugh, one of the preeminent preservation figures in American history. And he started this when he came to Hawaii in 1986 to begin the preservation program. And I took over from him in 1993. So all of a sudden now I get a chance to introduce people, and I'm really pleased to introduce my good friend and colleague for over 40 years, I figured, John Stubbs. He is Emeritus Professor of Preservation Practice and the former director of the Preservation Studies program at the School of Architecture at Tulane. He has his MS from Columbia, so we were not quite classmates, but around the same time. And he also attended the ECROM program as a UNESCO fellow. For many years, he worked with Beyer, Blender, and Bell, very important preservation architects in New York, who worked on many, many projects, some of which John will highlight today. And he was vice president of the for field projects at the World Monuments Fund for several years as well. And John had, through that job, had an opportunity to really travel the world and understand. He has been working assiduously for several years to put together a comprehensive history of conservation practice, beginning with basic theory, moving on to practice in Europe and the Americas, and then a volume, Architectural Conservation in Asia, and most recently a book that I collaborated with him on called Architectural Conservation in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands, which has quite a bit about Hawaii in it, and that just came out this year. I mean, last year, actually, the beginning of 2024. So again, but without further ado, let me introduce my good friend, colleague, mentor, John Stubbs.
Oh, thank you very much, Bill and Andrea, for the opportunity to speak again at the Iolani Palace meeting of the experts on architectural preservation. Well, I'm also honored to be the one to kick off this wonderful series you have planned for the next several weeks, and I'll do my best to give an overview of architectural conservation, a global perspective. And I might say a bit about how I got into this topic. And it really came from a dream coming true over my whole career, which has gone for about 50 years now. And but from the very beginning, and especially after working in Italy in college on archaeological digs, I fell in love with ancient history and old world everything, and really found historic preservation to be the medium by which I ought to study this topic and work in this area. And that I did. And I've had the most amazing career, really helping lead my generation into the maturation of the field of international architectural conservation practice. Well, along the way, as Bill said, I've worked at architectural firms and for 20 years at the World Monuments Fund in New York, where I had the amazing opportunities to see so much in over half of the world's countries in the way of architectural conservation practice. And in that role, I got quite interested in solutions in architectural preservation as practice all over the place, because learning from others, if you will. And so along the way, others, including gurus, said, John, you've been everywhere. Please, you ought to write about this. And I said, all right. And that I began to do in about 2003 with a book series that attempts to document architectural conservation practice in different parts of the world. So the first book is really an introduction to the field that we call Time-Honored, a global view of the field, where we talk about the structure, the nomenclature, the history of the field, the theories of the field, the parameters of the field, et cetera. So that kicked off the series in about 2009. And so the second book, which is where I was really able to get down to business on what's going on in countries, particular countries, in this case, the 67 countries that comprise Europe and the Americas. A co-author, Emily Marcus, and I did profiles of conservation practice in both the old world and the new world, which is an amazing experience. So it's all there, you know, from Estonia to Ecuador, from England to USA, all there. And it was really a fascinating voyage of discovery intellectually for me, but I was doing this from the standpoint of having worked in many of these countries and having met many people through organizations like the International Council on Monuments and Sites and the like, and working with these colleagues and producing these books. Here's the third book in the series, which was a very ambitious undertaking to try to chart the history and the contemporary practice of architectural conservation in Asia. By this, we really are talking about from Central Asia to all the way through to Japan and beyond, Indonesia, Southeast Asia included. So here you have a profile of about 23 countries, what's going on in these countries. And they're huge, long, complicated, wonderful histories as found in India, Japan, China, and the like. So it was a real fascinating project. It took 5 years to write these books, in this case with co-author Rob Thompson. The last book that Bill mentioned already was done with, just finished a year ago with 3 co-authors, the best in their areas of expertise. Bill in Hawaii, Julia Gatley in New Zealand, and wonderful Ross King in Australia. So these are the top people. And we had 59 contributors to this book to really enrich it with very detailed personal stories about conservation practice in the Pacific Basin. I think you've already heard a presentation or two about the contents of this book, so I won't go into it in more depth. But anyway, they're all done really for you, for me, for us, everybody that really needs a reference to what's going on in the field and how it all came to be. So I'll, in the next few minutes, go over some of the aspects of the field, and then end with some examples from all around the world. First of all, we must be reminded that there's a tremendous variety of architectural heritage around the world. You can imagine. Think about it. There are buildings in every country, often dating hundreds, if not thousands of years old, all kinds of variety in technique, material, and so on and so forth. So the subject matter is enormous. Really, it's almost infinite. So these are just a montage of the types of heritage that fall under the category of architectural heritage. But remember that it's also, the whole subject is very much related to cultural heritage in general. So it's quite important to respect, understand the other aspects of cultural heritage, such as intangible heritage. These are examples of intangible heritage: music traditions, weaving traditions, artistic traditions, cuisine traditions, etc. So these are really, one is tangible, one is intangible, but they're two sides of the same coin. It's terribly important to consider the human aspects of what we're doing in cultural heritage conservation. So another point here is that when you add this to the concern of architectural conservation, it becomes a truly enormous topic. Then there's a question of types of history, the study, the pursuit of history, the research of history. And that ranges too, as we all know, from book learning to archaeology to folklore to reenactions of historic events, like you see here in the Hukalaya voyage from Honolulu to Tahiti in 1976. That's a recreation of historic events that, as far as I'm concerned, has a lot to do with cultural heritage conservation practice. So there's that. Understanding history, ways in which to research history is terribly important. The field has really been boosted and informed greatly by the large subject of archaeology. And this all goes back to the Italian Renaissance when you think about it. Other disciplines that shaped the field of architectural conservation include art history, architectural history, but archaeology is among the most important aspects of cultural heritage conservation practice. And put another way, archaeologists today almost all are concerned with, in addition to archaeological research, conservation as well. So archaeology is a big part of architectural conservation. In fact, we call some of the techniques we use in architectural conservation above grade archaeology. Archaeology has its own wonderful methodologies that have also informed architectural conservation. You name it, from micro to macro. Here on the right is an image acquired from the Space Shuttle Endeavour from 1994 of Angkor in Cambodia using ground-penetrating radar. This had a tremendous effect on the work we were doing in architectural conservation at Angkor, but it's more of an archaeological exercise. So to be an archaeologist is a great background to have in going into architectural conservation. Another point to keep in mind is that architectural conservation, or saving old buildings, extending the life of buildings or parts thereof, has been going on forever, for literally time immemorial. Who knows, maybe it was the third or fourth occupation in all of human history, but we know this through archaeology. Here, for just one example, is a seated Ramesside figure in front of Luxor Temple in Egypt. If you look down low on the left, you see these strange dark gaps in the stone that are sort of butterfly shaped. Well, in sculpting this stone out of Aswan granite, it broke in the process of being hauled down the Nile to Luxor. And I can hear the conversations now when they brought it to the site in two pieces. Uh-oh, how are we going to fix this thing? And they did in antiquity. And this would be like 19th dynasty Egypt from around 1250 BC. So here you have a repair done to arguably a work of architecture that was done with the same concepts, the same intentions, really even probably the same techniques that we would be using 2,000 years later. So that's a very good example of repair, restoration from antiquity. Then the subject gets even deeper if you look at the history of most ancient cities and buildings in the world. I'll just pick one here. This is a tell. It's really Erbil in northern Iraq, which has been occupied and rebuilding itself in the same place since the 7th millennium BC. This is incredible to think about. So that's an example of continuity and heritage in the same place. So as far as I'm concerned, those are aspects of architectural conservation. So main point here, conserving old buildings has been going on forever. And there's some great books on the subject, and it's a hugely fun topic to look at the history of architectural conservation. But it's there about anywhere you want to look, wherever they were building, whenever they were building, people repairing buildings, and we can learn from that. Here's just one example in Rome, the Temple of Vesta and the Roman Forum, which is the form you see now as a partial reconstruction done in 1930 of a building from about the 2nd, 3rd century AD, but that building was itself a reconstruction or reenaction of prior temples of Vesta in the Roman Forum that go back to the 7th century BC. In other words, the Temple of Vesta was reconstructed about probably 8 or 10 times throughout its long history. That's, to me, architectural conservation, or continuity, if you will. Jumping in time, just again in Rome, is a great example of very sophisticated, theoretically based architectural restoration of a famous arch in the Roman Forum called the Arch of Titus. On the left is how it looked in the 18th century in an etching by Giambattista Piranesi. On the right is how it was reconstructed by a Swiss-Italian artist named Giuseppe Valladier, who found all the bits and pieces of this badly damaged arch all over the area and reconstructed it using a method called anastylosis. Anyway, he rebuilt the badly damaged ancient arch that you see on the right, using some very sophisticated philosophical concepts like distinguishing old and new in the building materials to be seen on close examination. So this, guess the date, 1820. So there you have it. Conservation, architectural preservation, restoration really is a discipline. It's more than a lay interest. It's a discipline, becomes to be a specialty in the early 19th century in Europe. Jumping just all over the place just to bring us up to date. Let's jump over to France, where they had a big problem in the 19th century, rebuilding lots of things from the French Revolution. And if there is a father of architectural conservation in the world, it's probably Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, who's illustrated right here. Some sort of genius architect, artist, man of letters, historian par excellence, archaeologist. He was everything, this amazing figure who had the problem of repairing and presenting historic monuments throughout France at the time from his position at Le Monument Historique organization based in France. these are his beautiful drawings of how Notre Dame ought to be restored. And he started this work in about 1840. And he developed through the course of his work a philosophy that he called unity of style. And he was really proposing to reconstruct, continue or complete unfinished buildings or repair badly damaged buildings in styles of architecture that would have been used in their day. So the restoration of Notre Dame in 1840, from 1840 to about 1860, was done by Viollet-le-Duc. He had many other similar projects at the time. And he was, as for deciding how it ought to look in the end, it was completely based on his understanding of medieval Gothic architectural history. And so he made these changes to the Notre Dame as he found it in the 1840s and embellished it with these things that really added to the character of the building and to give it the appearance it had before the fire and 5 or 6 years ago. So he basically designed it in a way that the original builders should have done, would have done, had they been able to do it. So he's taking some liberties, and we call that the restoration approach. It's a radical idea that actually was quite controversial in its day. Here he did the same thing in an entire town called Carcassonne to the west of France, where you see in the above picture, Carcassonne was just a rather intact medieval town, but no subsequent building. And then he added to it with crenellations and towers and battlements of the walls and whatnot. So Viollet was operating at 2 scales, the individual building scale and the urban renewal scale, restoring things to be like he thought they would have been in their day if it was possible. Across the channel was another school of thought that developed that really was in contrast to Viollet-le-Duc's. And in a word, it was led by John Ruskin and his wonderful follower, William Morris. And in a word, their approach was the conservation approach. Leave things in their damaged state. Don't overclean buildings. Surely don't restore buildings to look like new. That's completely antithetical to their philosophy. So we call that the conservation approach. So you see in the middle of the 19th century, theory developing in the field, which is actually really important. It defines the field in these 2 theories that I've just outlined so briefly, end up being really guidelines for how we practice ever since. So there's that. Okay, jumping in time as far as the evolution of the field from a lay interest, if you will, to a discipline, to a profession that we have today. One looks at examples around the world that ended up being real case studies to understand, like the Great Flood of Venice in November 1965. Caused a great deal of excitement among conservators and governments and others. How are we going to save Venice? This is a record high water inundation from the Adriatic Sea over flooding the Piazza San Marco in this case. And so that's a date and time, a month and time when one could say international practice in architectural conservation really got going. All these outside groups like Save Venice, my alma mater, the World Monuments Fund, got started in 1964 trying to help in Venice. Another thing that happened, a rather sensational international rescue project occurred at the same time, about 1964, which was saving the monuments of the Upper Nile in Egypt. And this scene on the right is an action shot of raising the great seated Ramesside figures at Abu Simbel to a higher elevation that wouldn't flood by the Nile. Every schoolboy in the world was looking at this. Everybody, these projects actually made history. People noticed it around the world and they got interested, or certainly noticed how conservation is an issue to be addressed around the world. So there's a lot of global empathy for the subject, support for the subject. In all my travels, and I've been around the world many times, I've never met anybody that said it's a stupid idea, a waste of time. I've met people who said, I don't know how you're going to do it, but I have never met anyone that says saving old buildings is a bad idea. All right, bringing us up to our time. What happens from the 60s, 1960s through to today is an explosion of interest around the world in the subject, where now virtually every country on the planet devotes something to resources effort to conserve its heritage, and certainly including architectural heritage. And a lot of this work is based on examples. In the field, we talk a lot about the power of example. Well, just at the time, rather innovative idea of saving Quincy Hall, Faneuil Hall, Quincy Marketplace in Boston ends up being an exemplar for several other large-scale urban renewal projects in the world. This inspired Covent Garden in London, for instance, that was renovated, which inspired the rebuilding of the harbor in Naples, Italy. And they've been copied, and in fact, Quincy Faneuil Hall was inspired by an even earlier project, another one in America, the Ghirardelli Chocolate Factory in San Francisco. So you see what I'm saying here, how these examples end up inspiring others, examples of their kind. Right. And so along the way, as the field matures to be the field we know today, we experts in the field and lay people as well develop an appreciation for all of history, all periods of history, as if it began 1 second ago, like it did. So along the way, we developed a fascination with conserving modern buildings, including Villa Savoy, west of Paris in France. Seen above is a hay barn after World War II. This 1927 iconic building by Le Corbusier was restored. It really was left unrestored for 20 years and restored to look like new in 1964, and was recently re-restored, put on the World Heritage List. So conserving modernism, conserving most ancient things, most recent past, is within the remit of architectural conservation. The field all along has been informed, strengthened by technique and technology. This really goes back to the Renaissance, but it really gets going in the 20th century, where the art conservation field adds a lot of techniques and technologies that inform the architectural conservation practice field. So science and technology are really the centroid of the field, if you will. And now there's science-backed projects going all over the place, specialists, whole laboratories devoted to certain things like chemical analyses, paint analyses, you name it, of stones. So you have literally work in the field operating at the minuscule micro level. So this is a big aspect of the field, is conservation science, if you will. It has to be said too that certainly from the early 20th century forward, increasingly, there was interest in documenting, developing theory or doctrine, if you will, rules, and governments needed to have this in order to measure the quality of work and agree on what to do with these important historic resources. So it's just as interesting to look at the history of doctrine in the field, like the Venice Charter, the Athens Charter, the Borough Charter, which comes out of Australia. And that was a source of inspiration for the China principles, etc. So by now, all countries have their rules and regulations. In the United States, it's our Secretary of the Interior's standards and guidelines for rehabilitation, which were based on these early charters developed and theory developed in Europe primarily. So there's that. And one last thing with regard to the aspects of architectural conservation, there's the national legislation in each country today that really is something. A lot of it was borrowed by countries as they became official. But when a country develops national laws for heritage protection, they've committed. I mean, there are resources, government resources and all that go into it. When a country has graduate programs in the subject, when a country has examples of architectural conservation practice, they're really moving in the field. They've joined the field of international architectural conservation practice. And I'm here to say, having traveled around this world, I mean, God, probably 20 times circumnavigated the globe, millions of miles. Every country is involved with this subject. So it's a really big deal and exciting for that reason. It comes down to this, if you could just bear with me with these two diagrams. On the right, what I've tried to illustrate with graphics is how the purview of architectural conservation goes literally from the minuscule, like those constituent parts of marble that you saw in the previous slide, all the way to the global perspective of the subject, which is the purview of groups like the UNESCO and the World Monuments Fund and the International Council on Monuments and Sites. So the subject area, I mean, in terms of the physical things you deal with, range from the minuscule building components, individual buildings, complexes of buildings, whole historic towns, whole regions. In fact, there are even global perspectives on the matter. That's really saying something here, that the purview that you'd be concerned with as a practitioner in the field range from the macro to the micro. On the left is a illustration schematic of the choices you have in dealing with historic buildings or parts thereof or multiples thereof. You can do nothing as a strategy, and that has been used a lot. You can arrest the decay of the building, do minimal repair. You can simply stabilize a structure. You can restore it, which is actually a really radical intervention. You can rehabilitate the building to be maybe through an adaptive use, recycling it to be a whole new purpose. You can reconstruct a building from being badly damaged in an earthquake or something like that. You can replicate a building on a whole different site across the world. You can relocate buildings, etc. So on the left, the image, the graph on the left indicates that you have these choices to make in dealing with historic buildings. And guess what? You find yourself almost invariably using several of those levels of intervention with each project you're working on. So then you can't know enough about the history of the field, the techniques used in the field, and the examples all over the place, near and far, in doing your own work in this field, because you really only have, it's serious work, and you don't want to make a mistake in the work. So getting good training in the field is rather important. Now, just a word or two about what we're up against. The perils are the perils. I mean, really. I mean, we all know these perils by heart, but certainly among the most destructive, of course, is fire. Another is water. And remember, water is in several forms. This is my beloved New Orleans, Louisiana, after Hurricane Katrina. That was a man-made and a natural disaster combined. But water is very damaging to buildings if it's not controlled properly. You have rising damp. You have precipitation that freezes and explodes masonry that it might that may have frozen in the process. You have a great example of rising damp on the right in New Orleans, where moisture is coming out of the ground and evaporating through the building fabric you're trying to conserve. There are other problems with the moisture, such as condensation. But the fire, water, and other things, many other things are negatively affecting built cultural heritage. Tidal surge, sea level change. This is Herschel Island in Canada, an Aleut fishing village that's relocated several times back onto the land from sea level change in that part of the world. It's happening. It really is happening. And in our book recently that Bill and I worked on, we have a great subchapter on sea level change, climate change affecting heritage in the Pacific region. Air pollution is something we have to deal with. It's a big part of it. As destructive, maybe more destructive than anything else in many ways, is war. We all know the story. We see it on TV all the time. So pick your place. And what's been interesting is to see how places rebuild after the war, and they make the choices that I was referring to about what to do in rebuilding. So lots of lessons out there, but we can't know enough about the sources of the problem. And there are many other problems. Just think of a few. Insect damage. There's something even called tourist wear, where handling of sites and traffic people through sites wears down buildings. There's something called age wear. There are many, many perils to antiquity to understand very well before you go into conserving these buildings. Another thing that's come up, and this is, of course, a human created threat, is the weird problem of iconoclasm, where a country will, or a culture or group of people will just decide that for religious purposes or something like that, the symbols they represent is to just destroy something. Well, here you have the Bamiyan Buddhas that had been minding its business for almost 1,000 years, blown up in an instant on TV in the 1990s. So this is man-made, calculated destruction that affects cultural heritage. And people have been wondering what to do about this one site ever since. But that shows you, points up the fragility of built cultural heritage. All right, so after understanding a bit about how it all came to be, the world got built out the way it is, and the efforts that people have gone to try to conserve the built environment, you begin to get into the question of who's doing what around the world these days. And I'll finish by showing you a bunch of slides quickly about a few examples. And there are these groups that operate at a global perspective, like my alma mater, the World Monuments Fund. We dreamed up this program to solicit examples of endangered sites around the world in 1993. And the program's been going ever since. And so it is possible to simply operate on a global basis. These are really logos of organizations working globally. I've absolutely start with listing the International Council on Monuments and Sites. Everybody should be a member of that. And the National Committee in America has a great, it's called World Heritage USA these days. The Aga Khan Trust for Culture worries about Islamic heritage. JICA in Japan works on helping architectural conservations abroad from Japan. UNESCO's at it. The Getty is doing amazing stuff, based in California, of course, working all over the world, et cetera. So just a note here about how there are organizations working globally in the field. All right, let's just look at a few examples of going on in the field. Back to Paris here. I've said in my classes, and I could tell the minute it was underway, that the restoration of Notre Dame in Paris is going to be the restoration of the decade. And indeed, it has been. We can all remember where we were when we saw Notre Dame on fire. That was almost 6 years ago, 5 years ago. A disaster. I mean, they sear into your imagination. I mean, it was a terribly upsetting situation for everybody. I think really certainly Parisians and Catholics. This is the mother church of the Catholic faith in France. So it was some sort of irony because they were restoring it, and the thing it had lasted for 800 years. So here's restoration underway. I'm sure you've all, with your interest in the field, have been watching endless newscasts on the amazing restoration effort for Notre Dame in Paris. Just a few action shots of that right now. And guess what they decided to do when they were wondering how to rebuild it? They decided to take it back to the period that Viollet-le-Duc was aiming for, when he restored the building in 1860. So there's a lot of controversy about restoring the spire of what's called the flesh at Notre Dame, and they decided after a lot of back and forth to restore it to the appearance it had right before the fire. All these people in the great nave of Notre Dame, every one of them, I love this picture, had a hand in the restoration of Notre Dame. You had craftsmen all the way to fundraisers, you name it. There are over 1,000 people portrayed in this group shot in the nave of Notre Dame that worked on its restoration over the last 5 years. So here's something that might be more easy to relate to. And fun it must have been for everybody. You know that there was a spirit of collegiality, cooperation, in doing this very, very sacred, important work. So whether you're restoring the bronze bells or the stained glass or the lumber, the timber frame, the roofs, you name it, hundreds of specialists and experts were on the case, working as a team under great leadership to restore it, sort of against the clock. In a way, I've said before, I've been quoted, deadlines can be a friend. They have a way of kind of forcing people to focus to get things done at a point in time. So I just was lovely slides because it shows the spirit. I guess if you look closely, there's smiles on all these. People love their work in this field. It's extremely satisfying work with what psychologists call psychic reward. Repairing old buildings, bringing something back to life, extending the life of buildings has tremendous psychic reward. And I'm sure that's how all the 1,000 people that work on Notre Dame feel to this day, pride. At the project as well, they very wisely did something that's really important in this kind of work, which is interpret to the public what's going on through the process. People are interested in the restoration process. So here you have sort of an impromptu interpretive center in front of Notre Dame that shows what's going on in the restoration process. So this is a big deal. Really as important, or certainly crucial to restorations in many, many cases, is the interpretation of the work and the history of the building. So it's really, a lot of these projects are best labeled as preservation and presentation of historic sites. Elsewhere in France, they're really good at architectural, cultural heritage conservation, whether it's caves like Lascaux or gardens all over France. Of course, France is famous for its formal gardens. They're leaders in the world at conserving these gardens. Why? Because they had the problem in the first place. So they figured out how to do it really, really well. Italy is leader in the world in conserving ruins, as at Pompeii, where people actually have been trying to conserve Pompeii and Herculaneum since they were discovered in the 18th century, late 18th century. So here's Pompeii. I had the pleasure of guiding a project there for a year where we looked at an entire city block. Pompeii is a heck of a problem because you're asked to conserve building fabric that was always intended to be covered. No one dreamed that these unsupported columns would survive in that area that's rich with earthquakes to this day. So literally in working behind the ropes at Pompeii, we were seeing things fall in the middle of a summer day in the ruins. The ruins are in a very dynamic state of deterioration. So ruins conservation is an expertise in Italy. Why? Because they've had the problem longer than anyone else. They're really good at it, and it's complicated. They have their own special problem of conserving the hill towns of Tuscany in Italy. There are dozens and dozens of dying or dead towns in central Italy, especially southern Italy too, where the youngsters have gone to the bigger cities for jobs and left their parents behind. And there's plenty of dying, wonderful towns dating back to the Middle Ages throughout Italy. But there are preservation groups, including some international ones, that are trying to look after preserving and presenting the hill towns of Italy. So it's a special typology, special problem. They're really good at it. But I mean, Italy is really a must know about place in the field, and there are training opportunities there, by the way. But they've got examples of great conservation practice at all scales. Just to name one without showing you a picture, Venice. Look at that. We have a big chapter in the second book on the great efforts to preserve Venice. Extraordinary engineering projects. Engineering, by the way, conservation engineering is a specialty within the field. That's very, very important. Just showing you one slide of Germany, where in Germany, there's a lot of experience in rebuilding after war, World War II in particular. So you have great examples of stone conservation in Germany, but they're also real good with conserving modernism. Here's the Bauhaus, the famous learning school from the 1920s, 30s, after World War II, and here it is restored about 10 years ago. The war-ravaged cities of Europe.
I have to give you a 5-minute warning if I could, please.
Okay, all right. World War II in Europe was a laboratory for learning the rebuilding of the cities of after World War II, like Krakow, Gdansk in Poland, many dozens of cities that had to be rebuilt. So the Poles got really good at reconstructing after World War II. Same in Russia. One doesn't know much about restoration experience in Russia. There you have the Alexander Palace that I had the honor of working on, where Nicholas and Alexander and their family spent their last years after restoration. Here it is after World War II. Here are some of the interiors after real accurate, serious architectural restoration. The Middle East. A lot of good experience there. In certain countries in particular, like Jordan, they've gotten really good at preserving and presenting this particular sandstone architecture at a very large site that has a lot of tourism. So there's experience there. There's some other experience in what are we going to do about deliberately damaged buildings after the in the hands of iconoclasts. ISIS, in this case, destroyed these buildings at Palmyra in Syria. What's going to happen with them? How are they going to be restored? And here you have iconoclasm going on in various museums in Syria, at Nimrud, for instance, in Iraq as well, where just people went in and destroyed these things. They have to be conserved. Africa is, people don't realize that there's well, you can easily imagine tremendous cultural heritage conservation work to be done in Africa with some very clever people going at it with a lot more to do. Name your area, name your culture, name your architectural type. In Ethiopia, you have Lalibela. These are rock cut churches cut out of live rock. So architecture sort of in the negative, if you will. Hard to conserve, to keep rainwater out of these buildings. People have been working on this now for almost 50 years in Lalibela, Ethiopia. There's also a type of heritage that's sort of come to be defined in the last 20 years by our Australian colleagues, called sites of conscience, or put another word, conserving history that hurts. This is a slave castle in Gorée Island, Senegal, and on the right is the portal of no return. So through this portal, African slaves were transported to the New World. So this is a case of preserving and presenting a heritage that's difficult for people to handle, but it's super important. The techniques of architectural conservation are brought to bear at a place like this. Similar thing, Robben Island, the famous penal colony in Cape Town, South Africa. The prison cell of Nelson Mandela is preserved and presented. India has a lot of experience with architectural conservation. Believe it or not, the Taj Mahal was in terrible condition when the British arrived in the 18th century, with all kinds of stone conservation issues. And it's being actively conserved periodically at this time as a result of air pollution. India is also really good at a lot of things in conservation, but one that I was very impressed with is urban conservation, as we're seeing at Ahmedabad in India right now. This is the way it looked before conservation work in this very dense city, and beginning to show you how it looks when it's cleaned up and things are conserved and presented in ways that are right for the locals who live there. This is all about doing things for the locality, for the people, by, for, and about the people, and as much as possible. Angkor, you've heard a lot about this, I'm sure, already. Bill Chapman put his finger on it, saying Angkor is the best laboratory in the world for the study of architectural conservation. The World Monuments Fund had the honor of working on 3 of the temples that are illustrated in this old National Geographic Axon of Angkor, and myself have been working there for almost 30 years. Amazing stuff, but over from scratch, we've worked with locals, internationals as well, to figure out the right approaches at these various buildings. Here's just the restoration of a portal, a porch, if you will, on a gopura at the site of Preah Khan. Before on the left, repair work in process in the middle, after. The philosophy used here is simple structural repair, not restoration, not making it look like new, structural stabilization. That's the philosophy. Training was a huge part of our work in Cambodia, training up the next generation. And there you see action shots of training there, including international training. Those are my students from Columbia University on the left, learning from a Khmer student who is telling them what he's been doing at this site called Tassom in Angkor. Elsewhere throughout Asia is an amazing collection of number of buildings that have to be looked after. You name your country, Burma, China has extraordinarily rich cultural heritage. The Great Wall, the largest building in the world, is undergoing conservation. Historic towns in China are being looked after properly. There's been a lot of renewal of towns and insensitive restorations of towns, but now in certain areas they're properly conserving and presenting towns, like this one in Yunnan province called Shaxi Village. That's a celebration of the proper restoration of Shaxi Village done with an international consortium. Japan, I'm just showing you one building. They have tremendous experience in conserving wooden architecture. They've brought to the world community whole new notions of conserving authenticity in architecture. Australia, with its amazingly analogous history to the United States, is really, really good in architectural conservation. Whatever the building type, from Victorian town hall in Sydney to modern buildings also in Sydney, they're really, really good at it, as good as can be. But they're also dealing with types of heritage that are unusual in their work. They're really contributions to the field, such as sites of conscience, prisons in Australia, like Fremantle and Port Arthur. Australians have gotten really good at preserving and presenting these sites of conscience. Australians are well underway and doing great work so far in looking after Indigenous or native Aboriginal Australians, their heritage, which is a giant subject dating back, some of the sites date back 60,000 years ago. But they've got work to do in this area. It's hard to conserve these cultural landscapes. Here's one in Western Australia called at the Burrup Peninsula that has got great rock art, but it's suffering from air pollution. So Australia, as great as they are in the field, they're still working at it and learning techniques. The Pacific, all about the Pacific. Everybody watching this has thought a lot about heritage conservation in the Pacific. They're great examples of conservation practice all over the place. In our most recent book, these are just the World Heritage Sites in the Pacific. So there's plenty there all over the place to look after properly. One site I had the joy of meeting just a year and a half ago was Nan Madol in Micronesia, which is as monumental as anything I've seen in Cambodia or in Indonesia, whatever. There you are in Micronesia, Pohnpei. Hawaii has awesome heritage, cultural heritage of all kinds, and you all have done a wonderful job at conserving and presenting your cultural heritage in Japan. And Hawaii, Chapman's chapter on conservation in Hawaii is a must read for all of you who live there, and you'll really be amazed with the great thinking that's gone into preserving and presenting your entire state. World War II heritage has to be looked after properly. Big history, no question about it. Difficult to conserve and present. It's an aspect of heritage conservation. And the polar regions have cultural heritage to look after. Arctic huts. This is Ernst Shackleton's hut in Antarctica here that has to be looked after properly. Guess what the big chief problem was in preserving and presenting Shackleton's hut for the early conservators about 10 years ago? Penguin guano. The penguins used to sun themselves on the dog kennels in the upper right picture. And that was a problem of how do you conserve a building from being buried in penguin guano? So what you have to do in this field is absolutely amazing. Headed home now to the United States, if you will. South America, in one or two images here, extraordinary history in every country of South America. One site, kind of a vernacular site in Peru called Huaro. It's called the Sistine Chapel of South America, of Peru. Amazing paintings that have to be conserved and presented just south of Cusco. Beautiful restoration work going on in Peru, like the other countries of South America. Headed home to the US, you've got the monuments of Central America, like in Tikal, that Guatemalans have learned to preserve and present really brilliantly. Mexico City, just think about it. There's one city here with entire layers of history that are now very ably conserved and presented very effectively with cool interpretive programs, etc. In Cuba and the Caribbean, I've never seen more good ideas in architectural practice in the world than in the island country of Cuba. Amazing work being done. And the only main point I'd like to make here, it's been done under the brilliant leadership of the late Eusebio Leal, the gentleman seen illustrated in the top. He was a city historian who figured it out. He had the problem. He had the mandate to figure out how to preserve and present Old Havana and the other cities of Cuba. Brilliant example.
I have to probably get close to wrapping up.
Okay, I'm through now, Bill. And just because the USA is a fairly young country by comparison with old world doesn't mean we don't have awesome history in the topic. From early example of restoration, like at Mount Vernon, to be restored to have the look that it has today. With all of our amazing array of building types, you name it, from all the way through to modernism. That was Taliesin West. Ellis Island, a great example of rehabilitation. We're really good at big conservation projects like Grand Central Station, Ellis Island, you name it. And finally, another just example of innovation in our heritage conservation, the High Line in New York City, a reused elevated railway to be a kind of linear park. And this is my last slide of an architectural conservation project. How do you end a slideshow like this? In fact, but it's a Hindu temple called Tanah Lot in Bali, being used as a destination of worship, as seen in this illustration right here. Main point here is this work is terribly important. It's extremely interesting. We're in a race against time, and it really comes working as a professional in the field and working, or as a layperson in the field, it really comes down to 4 subjects: bringing history to light, understanding the cultural legacy, advocating for conserving and presenting cultural heritage in all of its forms, advocating, speaking for history that can't speak for itself, building capacity to do this kind of work. This is done through the training programs and offices and teachers in the field. And finally, education and training, which is so important to continue this kind of work going forward. That's really it. I'm sorry for this sort of rapid fly through this giant subject. It's all presented in greater detail in the book series, but I hope this has been of interest to you. And it's a very serious subject, but it's a hugely fun topic and a great discipline for those of you considering specializing in this discipline at programs like Bill Chapman's program at University of Hawaii in Manoa. Thank you all.
Wow, John, thank you so much. And what an extraordinary world tour. So if that didn't manage to excite people, I can't imagine anything would. So, and I want to thank you for being the inaugural speaker. That was such a terrific presentation. And we're going to be in this series for the next 5 lectures. We're going to have a chance to meet some of our local practitioners who are not kind of working in the boondocks. They've been at the forefront of a lot of the work that goes on internationally. So I look forward to having you see and listen to Glenn Mason and Tonya Moy and Katie Stevens and Graham Hart and I think we may have missed one, but you're going to have a chance to see them all. And also tell your friends this is also videographed, so you can see this on video. And Andrea, do you want to close out for us?
Absolutely, John, absolutely incredible journey. I'm just so blown away. Fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for joining us. I just reiterate Bill's words. Next week, we have Glenn Mason presenting on Queen Emma Summer Palace on Oahu and Shikoku 88 Temples Pilgrimage Monument in Holualoa, Hawaii Island. Please, I want to thank my colleague Michelle Kisek, who's been doing behind the scenes technical support. And we encourage you to join us next week. Please sign up for the HHF newsletter. Please remember to take the survey when you log off. It's a really quick one. And thank you, Bill. What a great start. Thank you, everyone. Just fabulous.
Okay.
Truly.
So,
Okay.
Ahui ho, be in touch.
Ahui ho.
Week.
Hope to see you next week, everyone.
Thank you so much,
Aloha.
John. Thank you.
Thank you,
Aloha.
John.